Hey, good afternoon, Yiddelach. Here to continue in the Rambam. Today is chapter 2 of the laws of oaths. I'm sorry, the laws of vows, different than the laws of oaths. What did we learn about the laws of vows yesterday? You don't have to use Hashem's name. There's two types of vows, but we're only going into length on one. If a person should make something that's permitted to him forbidden, certain group of fruits he could eat to make some forbidden, the languages he can and can't use to make that happen. That was a pretty long chapter yesterday, but I think we got the drift. It was mostly about the language, what language is effective in making a vow. All right, so a little shorter today, thank God, and only a little about 19 halachas today. So let's see how we do. Halacha Aleph. Whether he himself took the netter from his own speech or a person administered an oath, a vow to him, and he just answered on main. Udavar shenyano kinyan amen, or spoke to him about the matter, and he answered on main. Shukabalas devarim. Those are all good oaths. Not exactly. Whether he took it on his own, or someone stated and he answers amen, or something which is similar to amen. What do I mean similar to amen? What does the Rambam mean? It means something that indicates that he accepts the matters. And in any of those cases, it would be a binding vow. He could say it, he could answer amen or something resembling amen. Halacha base. Ein anoder ne'asar b'davar she'asar la'atzmai. A netter doesn't make something usher that was already usher. Oh, I'm sorry. Ein anoder ne'asar b'davar she'asar la'atzmo. Ad sheyotzi b'sfasa v'hi piv v'libo shavim k'mo shebarnu b'shvuos. Whatever he wants to forbid to himself, it doesn't become forbidden until he speaks it out or answers amen, like we said in the previous halacha. Aval miskaven lenoder b'nazir v'nader b'karbon v'nader b'nazir b'shvu v'nazir, or sheniskaven lenoder nishbar sheniskaven lomer te'eni v'amar anavim harzamuta b'shneihem v'ein kan neder. The first of these are all pretty simple. The last one probably be a little more discussed at length. But if he meant to say, actually they're all pretty similar. If he meant to say one thing and said another, for example, he wanted to say a Nazirite vow and instead said about bringing a sacrifice, or vice versa, or he said he wanted to take an oath but he meant a vow, or vice versa, or he said figs when he meant grapes, or vice versa, and nothing happened there. Everything is still completely permitted to him. His words and his intent have to match. It's not just that he speaks it out, he has to speak out what he meant to say. For the words to be binding, it has to be with the proper intent. Just trying to get the mic right here. All right. Anyway, continuing weiter. What do we got? Halacha Gimel. Hanoder al das acherim. What if he takes a netter on according to someone else's knowledge? Harizek and Ishba al das acherim. It's like taking an oath on someone else's knowledge. Hanoder v'chazer boy tokedi dibor, and someone who retracts his vow within a very short period of time, or shemichu bo betokedi dibor v'kibo, or someone else protests against him immediately, and he agrees to what they're saying. Harzamutar, then there's no oath. V'din kol elo devarim v'nevarim kedin in shvuos, just like in shvuos. So a person can make his vow dependent on the knowledge of others. And this, okay, if he retracts immediately, no vow. If someone rebukes him immediately and he hears him out and he accepts what they say, no vow. And everything is the same as what we said in Shavuos. By Shavuos, if someone wants their oath undone, he has to seek out a sage. And if he made it according to his own knowledge, then he himself could go. But if he made it according to someone else's knowledge, he would need them to accept that he wants to get out of it. Or if he made it on the knowledge of the public, then he would need the entire public to let him out. So we're saying the same applies over here. That's a little loose. It should be checked to make sure, but that is the flavor. Halacha Dalid. Mishnah Hisna Kodem Shedid over Amar. What if someone stipulated before he made the vow. And what did he say? Kol neder she'adar mekan va'ad eser shnanim. Any vow I make for the next 10 years, hareini chozer b'chen. I'm already retracting. Or harei metalin, or they don't count, or kiyotzi b'dvar me'elu, or anything like that. V'achakach neder. And then he takes a vow. Im hayazocher tanai v'shas shenadar. Im hayazocher hatanai v'shas shenadar. If he remembers the stipulation of the time he's taking the vow, haynidro kayim, then his vow would stand. Shari b'tanal tanai b'neder, because it's as if he revoked the condition that he made, b'neder zeh, with this particular neder. Discuss that in a minute. Ve'im lo zachar tanai ela achar shenadar. But if he only remembers the stipulation he made about all his future vows being retracted and nullified, if he only remembers that after he took the vow, afal pi shekibel tanai b'libo v'kimu, even though he accepted the condition in his heart and he maintained it, hari neder batal. It's the neder is wiped out, the vow is wiped out. And even though he didn't restate right now that he wants to retract, he said it earlier. And there's who say we should be really strict. And even if he remembers afterward, that the remembering has to be immedially after. All right, let's try to understand that. What he said was pretty clear. He says, I'm going to retract from any vow I take in the future, or something like that. If he remembered at the time he made his vow, it is a vow. Because by saying a vow, it means what he meant earlier is undone. If he didn't want to take a vow or he wanted it all nullified, he didn't have to open his mouth. But if he didn't remember, then the vow is nullified. Even if he remembers it right after. If at the time if he didn't have it in mind, if he had it in mind when he said it, it means I don't mean it anymore. But if he didn't have it in mind, he forgot what he said previously was binding, it would wipe out his vow. And even if he were to remember it right after, it doesn't help, because we need him to remember it at the time. If he doesn't remember it at the time, it's as if he thinks he's just making a vow with no conditions and forgot the previous conditions, which are full on in effect until he personally nullifies them. The one vehicle we've given him to nullify them is to say that if he's saying it with intent and remembering what he meant earlier, that shows that he means to nullify it. But if he doesn't bring to mind that he said it earlier, I can't find any intent. If he remembers what he says and he says it anyway, it shows me he didn't mean what he said before. But if he's just forgot what he said before, then it's not really clear to me how I have to leave his word standing. So even if he remembers right after, it's still going to be, his vow will still be wiped out. And there are those who will strictly say, for the previous stipulation to be meaningful, he has to remember it right before taking the vow. Like he has to bring it to mind immediately before taking the vow for it to be mastama, for it to be wiped out. So he has to actively bring it to mind right before he takes the vow for it to be wiped out. Or it could be the other way around. He has to bring it to mind for it not to be, it's not so clear from the language over there. All right, we'll continue momentarily. Yelek ad mosai. All right, see you in a second. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Sorry if anyone just got a big squeak in their ear. I'm trying to make sure we have volume. All right, continuing on in the Rambam, halacha hey. Mi shehiktim es hatnai l'shanu le'eser, someone who precedes his condition even a year or 10 years. And then he took the vow. But he remembered at the time that he did make the stipulation. But he forgot exactly what he'd stipulated. But if he says, I'm going according to what I said first, it doesn't count. It's mavatal. But if it doesn't say that, then the tanai is already wiped out. The kiyam neder, and the neder will stand, the vow will stand. Shahari zachar b'shas haneder sheyesham tanai, because he did remember at such a time, and even though he remembered. Let's put it together a little more clearly. What do we say? How if he made the stipulation for a year, 10 years, that anything he would say would be wiped out. And later on he does take the neder, but he doesn't remember exactly what he stipulated previously. So he's bringing it to mind, but doesn't know exactly what. If he says, I'm going according to my original intent, then his vow's wiped out. But if he doesn't say that, since he does at least have the stipulation in mind, he's making the vow anyway, it shows that he really wants it, and the original stipulation is wiped out, and it would be a good vow. Halacha Vav, V'yesh mi min ha'ga'ainim, there's some from the Ga'ainim, that's a certain period of history. The Tanoic period extended from a little before the destruction of the Second Temple till after, and then the next 500 years after that's the Amoraic period. The next 500 years after that is the Go'anic period. This is around about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, more like 1,200 to 1,700 years ago, approximately. So some of the greats from that time period, what categorized that period there? The Gemara was pretty well learned. It had just been compiled, and people were pretty fluent. There's not so much writings that come out of that time because what was put down at that point was complete for the population at that time. Unlike when the Rishonim started with Rashi and Rambam, that people needed more words and needed a lot more help to understand the Torah, so they came up with, so they generated a lot more writings. But during the Gaonic period, the amount of text we had was pretty well sufficient. So what did some of the Gaonim say? Shamar ein kol hadvarim ha'ela noegin ela b'nedarim ovad. They say all these things we're talking about, it only applies to vows, v'lo b'shvuos, but not to oaths. V'yeshim shemorish adin and darim b'shvuos bin yanos ela echad heim, and others say it applies to both. V'chi yesh lo laktim etanai l'shvuos v'gederek shamar b'darim. So how do we deal with the fact that there seems to be a disagreement amongst the Gaonim how to handle this situation? So one may issue a stipulation nullifying an oath beforehand in the same manner as stated with regard to vows. Okay, so apparently we could rely on the minority opinion here and treat vows and oaths the same, and if he makes a stipulation in advance, it would be the same as the laws we learned previously. If he brings it to mind, it would wipe out the previous condition and the vow or the oath would stand, and if he doesn't, then the previous statement stands and the vow or the oath is wiped out. Halacha Zayin, Stam Nedarim Lahachmer. Somebody just takes an unspecified vow. When we rule strictly, what does that mean? Pareshon Yeshbo Lahakil Ulahachmer. If he explains to us what he meant, then you could rule leniently or stringently. Ketzad, let's give an example. Ha'omar Ari Haperes Elo Alai Yizar Maliach Ukiyayin Nesek. What about somebody points at a pile of fruits and he says, these fruits to me are like salted meat and avodah zorah wine. Well, salted meat's no problem, but avodah zorah wine's a huge problem. Omrim lo, my libcha. What did you really mean? Im parasha amar kivasam aliach shel carbon. If I meant salted meat of an offering, ukiyayin sheni stasek al gabi zbeach hayabelibi. I meant wine poured on if he meant wine poured as a libation, which he meant poured wine. The simple understanding would have meant avodah zorah wine, idol worship wine, but he could have meant it was just poured wine, that it was wine poured on the altar as an appropriate offering. Hariza usher, this would be a real vow, and the fruits would be ushered to him. V'im amar lo hayabelibi ela tikroivis avodah zarah. But if what he really had in mind was avodah zorah, and wine that was poured to it, hariza mutar, then he could eat the fruits. V'im neter stam hariza usher, and if he just says plain, then it's forbidden. So if we can interpret what he meant and he'll give us a viable interpretation, we'll go with it. And if not, we rule strictly. Halacha ches, v'cheina omer hari aperos alai cherem. What if he says, these fruits to me are like a dedication offering? Im kecherem shel berek abayis aser. If we say, what do you mean? And he says, like, I dedicate them for the upkeep to the temple, the fruit would be aser. Im kecherem kohanim, but if he says it's like stuff set aside for the kohanim, then it would be mutar, mubnei shehem amamush lahem, because that's Konim's cash, ain ba iser, there's no iser, im stam, aser, and if he just says it's stam, it's aser. So another can, if a person says cherem, he could mean it's set aside, it's designated, it's far from him, but how far? Far from him to the extent that it's holy, like a temple offering, or 5 for him, like meaning money set aside for the temple's upkeep, or meaning that it's set aside for him because he's not a Kohen and he's setting it aside for the Kohanim, and it's holy to him but profane to the Kohanim, in which case it is not an all-encompassing holiness that would wipe out the fruit and make him unable to eat it. And if he just says stam, just chayrim, and we don't know what he means, then we rule strictly and the fruits are forbidden. Halacha tes, hari hanalai kemaiser. What if he says the fruits are like meiser? Im kemaiser behema aser. If he says they're like the tithe of the animal, they're aser. Mim neshehu carbon sheikdishu biyado kemoshavarno. Like we learned last chapter, that would be an effective language to state a vow, so the fruit would be aser. Im kemaiser dagan. But if it's like the tithe for grain, mutar, then it's permitted. V'im stam aser. And if he says it without any intent, then it's aser. I think it's referring to, the tithe taken from grain is not forbidden to be eaten by ordinary people. Mastama, it's talking about the first tithe, which we give to the Levite. There's a lot of agricultural laws, just to say Roshi Parakim quickly. Person harvests 100 barrels of wine, 2 go to the Kohen. That's the intermediate amount, and about 10 go to the Levi. This would be the first tithe. Difference being, if you go over to your friend Yochanan Halevi's house, he can invite you to join with him, and that's no problem if you're Israel. But if you go over to your friend Shimon HaKohen's house and he wants you to share with his truma, you can't do it. So we see by the Meiser, it is the Levi's, it's his cash, but it's something that anyone could eat, so it's not a holy item. It's not removed from you. So then if that's what he meant when he said Meiser, then the fruits are still permitted. Hang on one second. Excuse me. Hi, sorry for the delay there. Quick pause. Looks like we still have volume, so going weiter. Halacha Yud. Hayhain alai ketruma. What if he says it like truma? Im letrumas halishkach niskaven. If he meant truma for the chamber of hewn stone, hariza asa, then that's asa. Im letrumas hagarin niskaven mutar. But if he meant it was for the kohen, it's mutar. V'im stam asa. If he doesn't make it clear, it's asa. V'kein chol yotze b'zeh. So very similar cases. If he meant the money was donated for sacrificial offerings, I said the chamber of hewn stone because what's kept in there, I guess apparently is the money for the sacrificial offerings. Check that up and be a little more clear. But that seems to be what it's saying here. So several cases where we're not sure what he meant. If he doesn't make it clear, we treat it strictly. If he makes it clear, we go according to what he said. Yud Aleph, what are we talking about? Makom Shemashma Kol Echad Me'elu Sham Shnei Yanus, where each interpretation is equally likely. But if it's a place where when a person says one of these languages, it's clear what he means in that place, and he uses such a language, so that's also. If it's a certain town where everyone says cherem, they mean cherem for the bedek abayis, then it's going to be aser, because we assume he meant what the people of the town mean. And if it's their way to talk about that this is cherem for the kohanim, and also similar to this, because we follow the language of the people in the time. So in terms of being able to interpret his words, that only applies if the people in the town don't use this expression for a very well-known thing. If they do, then we're going to go along to what the expression is known to mean. Yud Beis, it's a long one. Hanoder b'cherem v'amar lo haya b'libi el cherem shel yam shehi hamichmeiris neder b'karbon v'amar lo haya b'libi el b'karbonis hamlachim amar l'chavera hari za'atzmi alecha karbon v'amar lo haya b'libi el la'asro b'etzem shinachti li liyos neder bein derech schok nader shelo sehane lo ishto Amar lo haya belibi ela ishti rishayna shegarashtiha ken chol yotze be'elam advarim shemashman l'chol am iser v'hu omer lo niskavanti ela lekach im chaya anoder Talmid Chachamim. If it's a Talmid Chacham hari zamuter ve'en sarich she'ela chacham, we'll go through the whole thing. He doesn't have to get it repealed. Ve'im haya amaretz, but if he's illiterate, marin be'einav shezeneder ushuhu aser. We make him think he took a real vow, poskin lo pesach makam acher, and we give him another chance, a materin loy, to be able to permit it. Ubein shahaya talmid chachamim or amar arts gorin behen. Either way, we give him a hard time for getting us in hot water. I know we haven't explained yet. We'll explain in a minute. Molam also shelo nagam minhag zeb and darim tell me he shouldn't behave such a way lo darim derek hesel, and he shouldn't treat these things lightly. Let's see exactly what happened here. If somebody says something that looks clear to all of us that he took a real vow, but then he says, no, that's not what I meant. But the way he explained it, just see here. The way he explained it, it seemed a little off. It doesn't really fit what we all understood. It's like, you're in a room, someone says something, we all think he means something, but he says, no, I really meant like this. You're like, didn't really seem that way. So in such a case, or he says something that's not very interpretable, or he even says that he was trying to make a joke, or he says about benefiting from his wife, and he says he meant his previous wife who he divorced. In all these cases where it seems like his explanation's a little bit off, a little strange, it doesn't really fit, and it's a little bit of fetch to get it in there. If he's a Torah scholar, he's already in the clear. It never was a vow. But if he wasn't, then we make him think it's a vow, but yet we give him a way out. And either way, whether Torah scholar or not, we rebuke him, and we say this isn't the right way to behact. You shouldn't treat vows lightly and say these, what do you call it? Say these type of emphatic expressions to sort of, pump up the volume, if you will, when it could really give someone a false impression about what you meant. Don't play around with vows. Say what you mean and mean it clear. It's not the time for using I want a hyperbolic expression. It's not quite the right word, but it's not the time to joke around and use your language loose and try to make a point. When you're taking a vow, be serious and say clearly what you mean. I don't know if we take vows anymore or oaths. We'll have to check that up, but anyway, the point is the language should be clear. And if the language is unclear and the guy tries to back his way out of it, or it seems clear and he's trying to explain something different, he's trying to get out of it, then if he's a Torah scholar, believe him. If not, not. But give him a way out, and either way rebuke the people. Anyway, the typical examples that we said here was, he said, he says, no, I didn't mean it. I meant for this certain thing. Or he said cherem, and he says, I meant a fishing net. Or he said about an offering, he says, then he said, no, I only was an offering for the king. Or if he says like a sacrifice, he says he meant a bone. It's all a little bit strange the way he's trying to explain it. But in all these cases, the rules are clear, like we said earlier. Okay, Yud Gimel. V'cheina omer le'ishto hari'at alai ki'imi. And so too, someone who says to his wife, you're like my mom. Or peretz elu alai kivas chazer. Or these fruits are like pigs. She'ein kan neder. There's no vow here. Like we've already explained, this is a little bit of nice chazara from yesterday. If it was a Torah scholar that said it, then nishtafer, he's in the clear of but if not, we still make him ask a chacham. Oh, why should he have to ask? We said yesterday these weren't binding words. Why should he have to go get it repealed? And we make him think, or make it seem to him that what he said was real. But we give him another way out, and we get him off the hook. Why do we go through this whole rigmarole for making it, even though it's not a real oath, we make it seem like an oath, and then we give him a way out? Why should it be? Because we don't want people to take oaths lightly. So all that is just to create an impression. You're dalid, and it only applies to it only applies if it's not a Torah scholar. If it's a Torah scholar, he's already off the hook. Yud Daled ha-hefker. What if something's hefker, ownerless? Aval b'she'eno neder, even though it's not technically. I'm sorry. If someone declares their property ownerless, even though he didn't state it in the form of a vow, neder, it's very similar. Because he can't just go grab it back. Ma'u hefker. What does it mean hefker? Or how does someone make something ownerless? Someone says, I don't know what he's holding in his hand or looking at, but he says all these properties are available to everyone, whether it's movables or land. How does the law work? Whoever gets there first and acquires it, they merit it. They get it. It's his. And even if it's the guy who declared it ownerless in the first place, dinabo kadin kaladam. He's like anybody else. If he gets there first and reacquires it, it's his. So how does hefker work? A person makes a certain statement declaring certain properties ownerless, and then whoever gets there first and performs an appropriate act of acquisition, he would acquire the item, including the person who made it ownerless in the first place. If he's the first one there and performs the appropriate act of acquisition, he too would acquire. Tezvav, hamafkir inim, whatever he just makes it available to the poor, avalola leshirin, but not to the rich. Eno hefker, that's not hefker, that's not ownerless. Achi hefker lakol, it's not hefker until it's open to everybody, like shmita, like the shmita fruits, the fruits of the sabbatical year. Hamafkir avadav vagdoilim. How about if someone frees his servants? How does it work? If they're adults, kanu atzman, they instantly acquire themselves. A slave went free, now he's his own person. But what about a child slave who is now free? He doesn't have the power to acquire, so he can't acquire himself. How does it work? Whoever gets there first acquires, like any other movable property. Okay, Test Zion, Hamavkiras Harkarka. What if someone declares his property ownerless? Someone who comes and performs an act of chazaka he merits. All right, I don't know if we want to go at length into kinyonim now, but typically if it's a small item, the way a person acquires it is pick it up with intent. If it's a little bit larger item, he could drag it. So other forms of kinyonim, don't really want to go at length right now, hand something over. But if it's a piece of land and you can't pick it up and you can't do any of this, what do? You have to make an act of chazaka. You have to improve the land, put a lock on a gate, open a gate, dig a ditch, do something that indicates ownership of the land. If a person comes first and does that, he would acquire the land. Din Torah, it's a law of the Torah, even if he makes it ownerless, even if there's only one person around, hefker, that still becomes ownerless. V'niftar min ha'maisros. And what are some of the laws of ownerless land? He's puttered from having to give maisers, one of the agricultural gifts, like will be explained in the appropriate place. But the rabbi stepped in and said, they said that laws of hefker don't apply unless the statement's made in front of a minimum of 3 people. In order that one can merit if he wants, and the other 2 could be witnesses. So they had a very specific halakhic reason. They want it should be possible that someone should testify to the kinyan the other party made. It won't just be someone's word against someone else's word. Here we have witnesses that someone acquired. At least the possibility that there would be witnesses. Ha'omer hari zeh hefker. If someone says this is hefker, v'zeh hari hasheni safek hefker, and this one says the second one, it says it's safek hefker. Let's see. If somebody says this is ownerless, and this, I'm sorry. If someone should make the statement, here's the statement the person made, this is ownerless and this. What did he mean with the and this? The and this part, it's questionable if it's hefker or not. And if he says this one's like this one, or Shamar v'gamza, or he says also this one, Harispisa sheni, then the 2 are associated with hefker v'dai, and then it's for sure hefker. So if a person makes an indefinite statement, it's suffix hefker, and if it's pretty clear, we treat it as hefker. What suffix is? This is ownerless and this. That's not so clear, but he says this one's like this, or this one also like this, and also this. Those would apply. So we learned those are the statements, and in terms of how many people have to be present, according to the Torah, as long as there's one person present, it would be a valid declaration of making property ownerless. But the rabbi stepped in, said there should be at least 3 people there, so that there's a possibility for 2 witnesses meriting watching or witnessing the acquisition. Yud Zayin, Hamavkir Sadehu, somebody who declares his field ownerless, Velo Zaka Ba'adam, and no one comes, Kol Shlosh Yamim, for 3 days, Kol Shlosh Yamim Yachalak Zerbai. I'm sorry, for three days he's able to retract. But after 3 days, Eno Chazer, he can't retract. Elim Kadam Zakaba, but he could still require it if he gets there first. If during the first 3 days nobody comes along, you just say, you know what, it's not hefker anymore, I want it back, and it's his. He doesn't have to do anything. But if 3 days go by and no one comes along, now he wants to back, he has to acquire from Hefker like anyone else. Yud Ches, Ha'omer Sadeh Uvkeres Liyom Echad. Somebody says, my field's ownerless for 1 day. L'Shabbos Achas for 1 week. L'Chodesh Echad for 1 month. L'Shana Achas for 1 year. L'Shvua Echad for 1 7-year cycle. Ad Shelo Zakabah Hu Acher, until someone comes and acquires, Yachal Akziboy. For the period of time that he stipulated, until someone comes along, he can retract. But if someone were to come along and perform the appropriate kinyan, he could no longer retract. How come here he has a little bit longer period to retract? Because it's a pretty uncommon thing. Because a person generally won't make his property ownerless for a limited period of time. Generally, if someone declares something ownerless, it's ownerless. It's not ownerless for 3 days or 5 days. That's a little strange. So if he makes it ownerless for a period of time, we allow him to retract any time during that period of time. It seems to imply, this is from me, it doesn't say this here, but it seems to be the idea that he loses his power to retract after 3 days is a stipulation of the rabbis. And they just, oftentimes, their decrees and their stipulations won't apply in an uncommon case. So since this is a little uncommon, they did not step in. That's the way it seems. It doesn't say that here, but it seems that way. Check it up. All right, halacha yud tes, davar hamuvkar sheba achar ushmaro. What if something was declared ownerless and someone else comes and they guard it? Vayumabit boy, and they stare at it. Shili flannel adam, so no one else should take. They watch it, so no one else should take it. Lo kananu ba'bata. That's not an acquisition. I don't care that the guy is standing there and keeping a good eye on it and making sure no one else gets it. He didn't acquire it. El ad sheyigbo im hayim until he performs an appropriate act of acquisition. The Rambam here says taka hagba, which is to lift it, which is the most common and the best kinyan. It just really doesn't leave much room for a question. Showing complete ownership by holding the item and supporting its weight. Oy shiyaksi b'karka, or he's muksik in the karka, he makes some type of improvement in the land, kederek shikonin lakuchos, like anyone else who would acquire something. Anyway, just saying clearly that, the Rambam is saying clearly that someone standing and guarding and keep an eye on something is not a kinyan. He has to make a formal kinyan. If he stood there for 3 days and made sure no one else took it, and then someone else came along and picked it up, tough nuts, the other guy gets it. Alright, so that's the end of chapter 2. We will try to prepare a little more in the future, and again, we're going to try to get the book with more notes so we can give a little more in-depth, more background, a little more clear shir. But anyway, thank you for joining. Everyone should have a wonderful day.